And so here we go. We have Bryan Kortis here, who is our National Programs Director at Neighborhood Cats. He is going to be speaking about persuading municipal officials to go with TNR. Bryan is the co-founder and National Programs Director for Neighborhood Cats, a leading community cat advocacy group with hands-on programs in New York City, New Jersey, and Maui. Currently, he and his wife, Susie Richmond, live in Hawaii, where they have helped transform the state from a high kill to a community cat friendly. In between stints with Neighborhood Cats, he served as grants manager for PetSmart Charities, overseeing over $21 million in TNR and spay-neuter projects. He has produced many of the leading educational materials on Trap-Neuter-Return, including co-authoring the Return to Field Handbook published by HSUS, assisting numerous communities in setting up large-scale TNR programs, and co-designed with Tomahawk Live Trap many of the most popular TNR traps now on the market. Bryan can currently be found teaching monthly TNR basic training workshops and advanced webinars with the Community Cats podcast. He also can be found out trapping out in the burn zone out in Maui too, where he and Susie have spent a lot of time since August in that project. So a lot has changed with Neighborhood Cats. So Bryan, I'm sure you're excited not to be talking about that topic today.
Yeah, there'll be plenty of time to deal with the burn zone later today for sure. But thank you, Stacy, and thanks everybody for attending. Got a lot of ground to cover, so let's just dive right in. Okay, so what I'm recommending is when you organize a presentation to a government official that you follow these 3 steps, and we'll go into them in a lot of depth. So the first thing is you have to make whoever you're talking to interested in community cats. So why should they pay attention? Why should they try to help with this situation? So the first step is to identify the government's interests in free roaming cats. What problems are they that are, relevant to government officials, and why should they care about it? Because, unfortunately, many people out there are not as evolved as we are, and they don't have the same passion for cats. So you have to get them interested on a level that they relate to and that they understand. So once you've got them interested, you want to talk about everything that you could do besides TNR. And the reason for that is because nothing else works. So if you can disavow them of the notion that just trying to remove them all or passing a feeding ban or something like that is a good solution, you try to lead them with the kind of situation where they understand that nothing else works besides Trap-Neuter-Return. But you have to go through the explaining that to them. And then finally, once you've got them interested in free roaming cats, and once you've got them feeling despair because there's nothing that you can do about it, then you introduce the idea of Trap-Neuter-Return, what it is, why it works, and you give examples of success. And there's little other advocacy tips we'll go over as well. But that's your basic structure that I'm recommending you follow. So let's get into step number 1 there. What are a municipality's interests in animal control? So, well, again, animal control is usually a government function, or it's contracted out through the government to a private agency like a local humane society, which then takes on a governmental role. So open admission shelters, cat intake and euthanasia is often an issue, and that can be quite expensive if there's a high intake rate and a high euthanasia rate. Complaint calls come into the municipality, come and trap these cats, and they're causing problems. So that's a lot of resources. The government may be paying for all the animal care and the medical care and the disposal of bodies if there's high euthanasia rates. There's also opportunity costs, which is all that time and money that's being spent dealing with free roaming cats is not being spent on other programs, maybe dog training or spay neuter programs or things that would enhance the opportunities for the community. So that's what in economics, that's called opportunity costs, when you're doing one thing, which means you're not doing another. And then high euthanasia rates and at open admission shelters typically result in poor public relations, and that translates into fewer donations and fewer adoptions. So from an animal control perspective, that's the strongest one for the government, which is in why they don't want to have a lot of free roaming cats in the community if they can help it. So what about public health? Well, rabies would certainly be on the top of the list of concerns. in areas where rabies is present in the environment. So like in the Northeast, there's a lot of rabies in the raccoon population, also in other parts of the country. And if one cat can, there was a story in Burlington County, New Jersey, maybe a number of years ago, where somebody found a mom and kittens in their backyard. So they brought the mom and litter to a local veterinarian who then raised the kittens and adopted them out. Well, it turned out they all had rabies, and over 30 people had to be treated for exposure. Doesn't mean they caught rabies, but it meant they might, and you can't wait to find out. So they all had to go through a prophylaxis treatment of shots, and at a cost of $3,000 per person. So that gave the local county government a lot more interest in Trap-Neuter-Return and getting these cats vaccinated. There are other zoonotic diseases and parasites that potentially cats can pass on. They're often greatly exaggerated, but there is still that potential. Public health agencies are the ones who often have to deal with quality of life complaints. If it's not animal control, it's going to be public health, the smell, noise, things like that. And then every time a public health inspector has to go out into the field and investigate a complaint about a free roaming cat, that's a cost. That's a monetary cost and another opportunity cost. Wildlife is, depending on where you are, the municipality may be very concerned about the potential impact of free roaming cats on wildlife, especially if there are what's called rare, threatened, or endangered species, animals that are listed on either state or federal statutes as at high risk. And cats can pose a risk to wildlife from more than one, not just predation, not just hunting, but also competition. So there's a crane that in New Jersey that's endangered, and they feed on mice. And when there are a lot of cats in the area, the cats either deter the mice or kill them and predate on them, and that deprives the cranes of a food source. So competition can be another way that free roaming cats can impact wildlife. And again, if you're dealing with a threatened, endangered species, even a small amount of predation can have a really devastating impact on that wildlife population. And again, this may sound like, I thought Kortis liked free roaming cats, right? And all he's saying is all this negative stuff. Remember, I'm mimicking a presentation to a government official whose first reaction may be, why should I be wasting my time on cats? Well, because there are very serious government interests involved, right? There's animal control, there's public health with rabies, there's the potential devastating impact on wildlife. So yeah, you should definitely be interested in this. That's what we're trying to accomplish with this first step. We're not trying to talk down free roaming cats. We're trying to show somebody who's not a cat lover why they should be spending time and money on this. Lastly, there may be a municipal interest in animal welfare. And this is probably the strongest as community cat advocates, from our point of view, but it's the weakest one. It's really important to understand this. It's the least interested one from the government's point of view. Okay, so we know there's high kitten mortality, short lifespan for adults who are not living in managed colonies. Of course, there's environmental dangers, from cats living outdoors, such as cars, potential cruelty, things like that. But this is stuff we all know really well. And the mistake that a lot of advocates make is they assume that this is what they lead with when they talk to government officials. They start talking about, oh, the poor cats, and they're living difficult lives and they're subject to all these things. And the city councilor's eyes glaze over because he's not a cat lover and he doesn't really care about how rightly or wrongly, he doesn't, his interest is in the people in his community and his constituents and his voters. So you should mention this because there are government officials who really care about this, who are like us, and this will be a primary motivator for them. But in my experience, most are not. This is the least thing that they're interested in. So don't, mention it, but don't try to make it your strongest argument. So why is it important to do this? Why is it important to start talking about the issues that free roaming cats cause? And there's a number of reasons listed here. So first of all, it establishes your credibility, okay? So if you're going into the mayor and talking to the mayor And his office is getting 5-6 calls a day complaining about the cats in their neighborhood. And you come in saying, oh, the cats really aren't much of a problem, we need to get them spayed and neutered, but then everything is fine and people are just exaggerating. You lose credibility if you try to pretend that there aren't serious issues around free roaming cats. You've lost your credibility as an advocate. On the other hand, if you acknowledge what's really going on, then you have the opposite effect. You establish that you are credible. Again, you're demonstrating that free roaming cat overpopulation is a serious issue. And this is maybe the most crucial thing, which is once you've acknowledged the problems about free roaming cats, you can move the discussion to the issue you really want to talk about, which is what is the best way to reduce these problems? How do you lower the number of cats? How do you reduce the negative impacts? That's what you want to be talking about. You want to be talking about solutions, not arguing about how serious, whether or not rabies is really a serious risk, or whether there's any disease potential, or whether the cats are a nuisance. That's not where you want to be spending your time. You want to be talking about solutions, but you don't get to solutions until you acknowledge the problems. So we've established in our government officials' mind that free roaming cat overpopulation, community cats, is a serious issue that they should pay attention to. So now we go to discussing, like I said, the alternatives to TNR. Excuse me. So again, remember, the goal here is to disavow them of the notion that there's some simple, easy solution besides Trap-Neuter-Return. We want to go over what they could possibly do, everything besides Trap-Neuter-Return. So first of all, you could do nothing, right? Which is the usual government policy. You could try to remove them all, and usually that's for euthanasia because of the community's already overcrowded. A lot of these cats are non-adoptable. Feeding bans, well, why don't we just get rid of the food? Then we won't have any cats, right? Another idea is that often pops up is, well, we'll pass some laws, we'll require all the cats to be licensed, and we'll prohibit them from roaming at large, and we'll put limits on the number of cats somebody can own or feed. Or you can wave your magic wand, right, and make them all go away. So I put that in, obviously I'm being facetious, because there is no magic wand out there, right? If you want to solve a real problem, you have to come up with a real solution. And we want to go through these 4 alternatives to TNR because we want to make the point that nothing else works. So let's do that real quick. Why doesn't doing anything work? Well, because you're not doing anything, right? And what is important to understand, though, is sometimes advocates get carried away and they'll say, like, well, there's 120 cats downtown, and if we don't do anything and each female cat has 7 kittens over the next 7 years, you're going to have 6,300,000. So which is ridiculous, right? And the reason that's not true is because every environment has what's called a carrying capacity. There's only so many cats that the downtown area can support. And the limit is created by how much food is available, how much shelter is available. Of course, that can change. It might go up, it might go down, depending on people moving in or moving out, but it's not unlimited. And once the number of cats exceeds the number that the environment can support, then you start to have disease, you start to have cats migrating to new areas, you start to have adult male cats killing kittens, things that Mother Nature takes over and starts to keep the number of cats balanced with the amount of food and shelter that's available. So if you do nothing, you'll just keep having the same number of cats. You'll always be at the carrying capacity of that environment. So sometimes you'll see a municipal official who will say something like, well, our program is working because every year we only bring in 515 cats approximately. So obviously we're keeping the population stable. And the truth is, you're not doing anything to affect the population. The population is already stable. So doing nothing just changes nothing. It doesn't address any of those government's interests that we talked about in high euthanasia rates and public health, et cetera. So it's really not a solution. It's just an ignoring of a problem. Well, how about trap and remove, right? Because when communities are active, this is what they usually choose, right? They send out their animal control officers, and if they're still following this technique, or they lend out traps to citizens, and they say, bring the cats in or take them to the local shelter, where, as I say, often, if not usually, they end up euthanized. Well, how come that doesn't work? There's a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, number one is in most communities, the number of cats is already overwhelming, and there are not, those of you who trap are well aware that it's not easy to go out there and catch all the cats in an area. So there's too many cats, there's too few animal control resources, and the animal control officers, they're smart. They don't want to spend their time on this. They know it's a futile effort, and there's much more, if they have to deal with a dangerous dog or, other issues that are more immediate and pressing in terms of public safety. That's what they want to be spending their time on, not on, rounding up a few cats and not really having any impact. Of course, the people who take care of the cats are not going to cooperate. They're not going to withhold the food. They're not going to tell you how many cats there are. They're not going to call the cats out so you can trap them and take them away to the shelter. Even if they can remove a lot of the cats, you end up with the vacuum effect, right? We talked about carrying capacity and the availability of food and shelter. So if you take the cats away, but you don't take away the food and the shelter, well, guess what? It's just an opportunity for some new cats to come along, start reproducing, and fill up that empty void, that we refer to as a vacuum. So basically, if there's food and shelter somewhere, and there are cats in the area, they're going to find it and they're going to start reproducing again. You have ongoing abandonment and lack of monitoring. When trap and remove efforts happen, there's no caretaker there. There's nobody to watch for the new cats. And basically, you have all of these things going on at the same time. So I think the strongest argument you can make about why trying to trap cats and just eradicate them from the environment doesn't work is because if it did, we wouldn't be here today talking about this. And up until about the maybe 10, 15 years ago, trying to remove cats was the dominant animal control approach for decades. And all it led to was this huge overpopulation of community cats. So just historically, it's been a failure. So, good luck trying it again. Won't work again this time either. So how about a quick response? If you don't have time to go through all, it's important that you understand why removing cats doesn't work. But how do you say this real quick? So here's a couple of canned answers you can try that I've had success with. So when you give your presentation and then some hard-ass cop at the table pounds his fist and says, why don't we just get rid of them all? I once, my first response is, okay, so who's going to do it and who's going to pay for it? Right? And I'll even go through the list. I'll say, okay, you're going to need to buy about 150 traps so you can keep at it at a pace fast enough. You're going to have your officers working overtime 7 days a week trapping because nobody else is going to do this for you. And once you start to go through the checklist of the reality of what's involved, that the critics usually back off because they realize it's, somebody's got to do it and somebody's going to have to pay for it. And then that last point, which is, if that's the dominant approach in your community, they've been probably doing it for decades, and you just point out like, hey, it hasn't worked. Why don't we try something new? All right, what about feeding bans? So that's often, there's often somebody in the government who thinks they've got this bright idea, right, of no food, no cats, so let's just make it illegal to feed cats outside. Well, they are not the first ones to think of this. They're probably the 10,000th, and it's never worked. I, in my 20 years of working in this field, have yet to see a feeding ban that resulted in a community having a lower cat population. And I'm talking on a municipal level. So they're unenforceable, right? Nobody listens to them. People don't let their cats starve. They just work around it. They go at night, they feed at a different spot. It's really impossible to enforce. Also, the cats don't just say, oh, there's a feeding ban, I'll move to the next town. they're very territorial. They stay where they are. They start to find new food sources. They may start moving in closer to houses, closer to factories, going inside them. Maybe they're a little sick now from not enough food, so they start getting parasites like fleas and spreading them all over the place. They may start hunting more. They continue to reproduce. There is research on coyotes that established that the more hunting pressure that was put on coyote populations, the faster they reproduced. So haven't seen any research to verify that with cats, but that is a phenomenon we've witnessed, where we've seen situations that we were at a dump, the city dump in New York City, and they closed it, and all of a sudden the cats lost their food source. And we just started seeing litters of kittens popping up all over the place with, of course, very high mortality rates. But nature has a way of compensating that is really hard to overcome. As I say, you can make the problem worse if you make the cats, you don't get rid of them, but you make them sick so that they start spreading parasites all over the place. And then, of course, when you think about it, you're basically trying to get rid of cats by starving them to death. And that's not, obviously not a humane approach. So how do we say this quickly? When somebody pops up and proposes that, there's a couple ideas for you. My favorite one is, well, while you're at it, can you ban rain on Sundays? And the humorous point being that you'll be equally successful at both. You can pass a law about anything you want, doesn't mean it's going to work, right? Name one town or city where it actually succeeded, because they will not be able to do that. And just the idea, you can't outlaw compassion. You can't tell people to turn away from animals that they love and that they've supported and stop caring about them. Okay, laws, let's pass some laws. Again, not the first to come up with this idea. There are laws about trying to control cats all over the map in virtually every municipality in the country, and they're just at this point usually unknown or unenforced because they're so ineffective. And the thing is that laws are targeted towards human behavior, right? They're not, the cats, you can pass a law saying it's illegal to have your cat running at large, right? Well, the cat doesn't know that. What you're trying to do is get the people to not let their cats outside, right? Now, whether or not they listen is one thing, but people who take care of community cats don't think of themselves as owners. The decision is not like, often with a pet cat, the decision is, should I bring this animal into my household? Should I go to the shelter? We want a companion. With community cats, it's not that process. The process is usually, I'm walking along one day, minding my own business, and boom, I see something. At my workplace, I spot a cat eating out of the garbage can. So I start to leave food, and it becomes more of a rescue, more of an act of compassion, but it's not an adoption. So if you start to tell people you have to keep your cats inside, you're basically putting up barriers to them helping community cats. But the community cats aren't going to go away. They're still there. Now people, maybe they're reluctant to work with them because it's illegal in some way, so they don't get spayed and neutered, and so the cats reproduce. So to the extent these laws work, and they usually don't, but to the extent they do, it's just going to make the community cat population grow because nobody's going to want to deal with them. Again, enforcement is very difficult, if not impossible. And again, as I just discussed, you're deterring caretaker contact. You're not stopping them from being free roaming cats. So, for example, you require all the cats that you define ownership as, you feed a cat 3 days in a row, you own the cat. That used to be the law in Baltimore. You fed a cat 3 days in a row, you were legally considered the owner. Now, as the owner of the cat, if you don't license all the cats you're feeding, you're subject to a $500 fine for each one. And each time you get a repeat violation, the fines go up. Well, guess what? A lot of people are just going to walk away, right? I want to help these cats, but not at, the risk of financial ruin. Or they'll just sneak around, or there'll be so many people and so many cats that the people charged with enforcing those laws don't bother. So laws historically have not been successful. quick responses. Let's pass a law requiring all the cats to be confined. You know, who's going to break the bad news to the cats? They're, you know, the unknown community cats. Hey, you're not allowed to roam free anymore. You know, who's going to catch the offenders? Who's going to pay for that enforcement? Because when these laws are passed, usually the city council or the mayor, they're not thinking about, they just sort of assume everybody's going to follow the law, and they don't think about, well, you know, how are you actually going to enforce this? That requires law enforcement officers, which requires money, vehicles, so on and so forth. So now we get to, you know, as I say, we've explained why the government has a strong interest in free roaming cats. We've gone through all the alternatives and why they don't work. And now we're up to, hey, how about Trap-Neuter-Return? This is where we really start to talk about it and its potential. And this part is the one I'm sure you guys know best already. But just to quickly go over it, obviously spayed neuter cats can't reproduce. And if you get enough of them fixed, a high enough percentage in a certain area, the population will drop over time. You have people in place to maintain the progress, to catch new cats who come in. A lot of TNR groups will remove adoptable cats when they begin a TNR program, which results in an immediate reduction in the number of cats. In terms of disease, obviously vaccinating against rabies even once is better than not doing it at all. And cats that are spayed, neutered, and fed regularly are healthier cats, so they don't catch diseases and they can't spread them. Nuisance behavior is an easy one. You know, there's a reason we fix our pets, because otherwise they would be a nuisance. So you eliminate the noise from mating, the odor from male cat spraying, and sterilized cats are actually much less visible. They roam a lot less. So even though there may be just as many cats there, you don't see them. So it seems like there's a lot less. As far as wildlife predation goes, obviously fewer cats is going to mean less predation, less competition, and all those other things. Other advantages to point out, instead of having the people who care for the cats resist your population control program, they will cooperate with it, as opposed to trying to remove cats so that they end up dying in the shelters. This TNR is a life-affirming approach, and you'll get a lot of volunteers as opposed to none. Because it's life-affirming, you can attract funding to support it and other resources that individuals and nonprofits will put into this that they won't put into a feeding ban, or they won't put into a trap and euthanize program. And it's aligned with public opinion. There have been numerous surveys done by respected polling agencies about, would people prefer for a particular stray cat to live outdoors or be taken in and euthanized? And the overwhelming prevailing opinion is leave the cat alone. That life, it's better that they stay alive than that they die. And again, you can make the point, nothing else works. So why, even if you're skeptical, why not try it? So let's talk about the people who oppose what you want to do. So you want to implement a Trap-Neuter-Return policy, but not everybody's on board with that, right? Or we wouldn't need to be doing a class on advocacy. So you are probably going to have opponents, and they're usually coming from the wildlife conservation community. And they have a very clever trap, and you have to know what that trap is in order to avoid it. And we go through these steps because we want to avoid we want to get to steps 2 and 3, right? Again, I mentioned the reason we go through step 1 and we talk about all the problems that free roaming cats have is so we don't have to keep talking about the problems, so that we can move on to steps 2, which is discussing alternatives to TNR and why TNR is the best option available. So we want to talk about solutions. We don't want to talk about, are the cats a problem or not? That's not what your opponents want. Your opponents want to stay on step number 1. They want to spend the whole time talking about how awful the cats are and what devastating impacts they have, and how they're killing billions of birds. And basically, they don't want to talk about solutions because they don't have any. If you read an academic article, something that's been published by a conservationist when it comes to free roaming cats, literally, if there are 50 paragraphs in the article, the first 49 will talk about all the problems that cats have. And at the very end, they'll say, and so what we should do is, and it'll be some half-assed solution that's been tried a million times and doesn't work. So it doesn't make a lot of sense because, right, they're opposed to the only solution that'll work. They don't have any other solution. So why are you against it? But they are, and that's the reality. So the trap they want to get you in is don't get to 2 and 3. Spend all your time on number 1. If you have an hour before the city council to do a presentation, they want to spend 57 minutes talking about how awful the cats are and spend very little time talking about what to do with it. They just want you not to do TNR. That's it. They don't care what happens after that. They just don't want you doing TNR. So this is kind of a graphic depiction of what I'm talking about. And remember, when you're talking to government officials, you have a limited amount of time, right? You may have 20 minutes at the city council meeting, or you may have a half an hour with the mayor, or whatever it is. And if you're there and the opposition to TNR is there, this is what they want. They want you to spend 29 out of those 30 minutes in the red, talking about, the cats kill the birds and they're not a native species and they spread rabies and the shelters are overrun because, they're subject to great cruelty when they're outdoors and my backyard smells off, all these things, right? They want to spend 29 minutes talking about that and very little time talking about what do you do about it? Because again, that's their Achilles heel. If you actually talk about what you're going to do about it, you end up with spay neuter. And they don't want you doing spay neuter, however kind of wrongheaded that is. Now, if on the other hand, you spend 25 of your 30 minutes talking about in the green, so you acknowledge, instead of fighting about and arguing about the impacts that free roaming cats can have, if you acknowledge, yes, they can adversely affect wildlife, they can be a problem for public health and for shelters, and you don't spend a lot of time arguing about that, you just acknowledge it, and you move over into the green, and you're spending most of your time talking about solutions, that's your best chance of winning, okay? If you spend all your time in the red, you're going to lose. Because again, the anti-TNR argument, when you cut through all the nonsense, it's an emotional appeal. It's designed to create fear and prejudice against free roaming cats. And then by association, TNR, even though that association is illogical. So what your opponents are trying to do when they show these graphic pictures of the cats with birds in their mouth, or, some cruelty situation where the cats were horribly abused and they show graphic photos of that. The reason they show such graphic photos is because they're trying to prejudice the decision makers. They're trying to move this onto an emotional plane rather than a rational one. As silly, as non-productive as that may be in the end, again, all they want to do is stop you from doing TNR. They don't really want to solve the cat overpopulation problem, or they would if there was something to do besides TNR, but they just hate TNR. Good reason I often just call it spay neuter now, because they've created such a bias against the term. So to understand that they're trying to run out the clock and not let you really talk about the nuts and bolts of solving the problem, and don't fall into the trap. Don't do that. Don't argue with them about the problems. Just say, yeah, there are problems. Now, how are we going to solve it? And spend your time talking about that. So how do you pivot from problems to solutions when this comes up, right? How do you avoid, when you're confronted with this really determined effort not to talk about solutions, but just to vilify the cats? What you need to do is what in media is referred to as pivoting. And we've all seen it on TV, right? Where there's a respected, experienced journalist, and they've got this politician in front of them, and they ask them the most direct question in the world. And then 2 minutes later, you realize, hey, the politician he's never answered the question, and he's just running on talking about something else that he wants to talk about, right? How did that happen? And that's what's called pivoting. And what you do when you pivot is, it's a two-step process. First is a good media savvy person will not ignore the question completely, because that's just too obvious an evasion, right? So the first thing is to quickly address the question and then shift over to what you want to talk about, right? So if they come at you and they say, well, why should we do Trap-Neuter-Return? Because, you know, the Wildlife Society says that the feral cats in the United States kill billions of birds and small mammals every year, right? Because that's what you're going to get. You're going to get like, why should we do TNR? You know, because these cats kill all these birds. So the way you would pivot is by acknowledging that, not by denying that feral cats are arguing about how many birds they kill. You just go to, well, the issue isn't really how many wildlife are being killed, but how do we reduce that number, whatever it really is, whether it's billions or millions or thousands? How do we lower the amount of predation that's happening? Well, we do that by having fewer free-roaming cats, and the way we get fewer free-roaming cats is by doing TNR. And now all of a sudden, instead of talking about how many birds and small mammals cats kill every year, you're talking about how do we get fewer free-roaming cats. You've pivoted from that issue that they want to debate endlessly, which is, is it 4 billion? Is it 8 billion? It's like, who cares? It doesn't matter if it's 3. We still don't want cats killing wildlife, right? So how do we have fewer cats? Here's another example that comes up, which is, cats are the domestic animal most likely to expose people to rabies. Every time that happens, it's an enormous cost, right? So do we want to argue about how much risk cats pose to people for rabies? Do we want to dig into public health statistics and say, well, there were only 7 cases in the last 2 years in this county? And, do we want to be spending our time talking about how much of a rabies risk cats are? Or do we want to acknowledge they are a potential rabies risk and then pivot to how do we lower that risk? So this is an example of how you pivot. So I'm acknowledging that rabies is a serious and costly disease. I'm not going to argue about that. Now I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about, which is vaccinating the cats as part of a TNR program can reduce the number of exposures. See, I've pivoted. I've gone from arguing about whether rabies is a problem to how we can solve whatever depth of a problem it is by doing TNR. So let me give you some more advocacy tips just in general. Now we've gone through that 3-step argument. And one thing that got left out of my bio, in case you're wondering, is I spent 20 years as an appellate attorney, so had to structure legal arguments and talk to government officials all the time. And then applying this to the TNR field has led me to that 3-step process. So remember, identify government interests, talk about all the approaches that you can use to solve those problems besides Trap-Neuter-Return, and then talk about how Trap-Neuter-Return really is the only thing that has the potential to solve the problem on a big scale. So here's some other tips as you're presenting this argument. One is what I call climb the ladder. Now this may vary and you have to use your judgment on this, but I like to start with not at the top of the ladder, which might be, say, the mayor or the county commission. I'd like to start with the people who are on the ground and directly dealing with the free-roaming cats. So my first target for my advocacy is going to be the local animal control agency or the public health agency or whoever's responsible for enforcing whatever laws there are or dealing with complaints about cats. And the reason for that is because if you can get their support, you can bring them along with you as you climb the ladder, right? If they oppose what you want to do, you can learn why. And when you go to the next level, you can preempt their arguments. And because what's going to happen when you go to the mayor and you make your arguments, guess what the first phone call is going to be? He's going to call the animal control officer. But you'll have already inoculated him against whatever anti-TNR arguments that person may have had, although hopefully they're supportive. So as you climb the ladder, you're bringing on more and more people and making your case stronger. Data can be really crucial in being successful. So the more you can back up, when we're talking about the problems and government interests, the more you can back that up with data, the stronger your argument is. So instead of just coming in and saying, hey, our county has really high cat intake and really high cat euthanasia, bring in the numbers. All right, how many are they taking in? what percentage are being euthanized? What's the cost for every cat that's euthanized at the shelter? You can calculate that. It generally ranges from, it depends on who traps the cat, how long the stay at the shelter is, but there's some cost involved in taking the cat, in housing the cat for whatever the mandatory holding period is. There's a cost to the euthanasia procedure. There's a cost to the disposal of the body. And you can usually get a number, it's going to range from say $50 to $150 per cat. You multiply that times the number of cats that were euthanized, and it's a pretty big cost usually. So that is, if you can turn it into dollar signs, that's going to get your government officials' attention pretty quickly. What about complaint calls? Are they rising? Are they going, are they constant? Because if they're constant or rising, whatever your policy is on the cats isn't working. And when it comes to complaint calls, you don't necessarily have to quantify them. You just have to sometimes get a qualitative assessment of them. So I've had success just going to the town clerk and saying, do you get a lot of calls about cat complaints? And then they're just wiping their brow and going, oh my God, every day they're just coming in. That enough is alone. You don't actually need to put a number on it. We talked about the costs. Sometimes if animal control is contracted out, then the municipality is paying a certain amount per cat. If they're paying a set fee on the contract, then it's whoever the contractee is, the Humane Society that's taken on the contract, then they're the ones who are bearing the costs for having too many cats, because the more cats come in, if they're only getting one set price for their services, then the more cats come in, the less, the more risk that they're losing money because they're not getting paid for each cat. So in other words, if they're getting $10,000 and they have to take in 1,000 cats that are costing $100 each to euthanize, they're losing $90,000. And that would be the agency you'd want to target for your advocacy. Local examples of TNR success there's a lot of examples out there in the literature, research, and just case studies that you can find on TNR success stories, but the most persuasive ones are local, because everybody tends to think that they're unique, their situation's unique. Like in Hawaii when we came here, it's like, oh yeah, well that works on the mainland, but this is home, and I'm thinking like, yeah, you're surrounded by water, but that doesn't really impact whether the cats are spayed or neutered and whether they reproduce, or it had nothing to do with it basically. But people do tend to think that their neck of the woods is somehow different, and that what works somewhere else isn't going to work there. So if you can find local examples of a TNR program where the intake went down, or complaint calls went down, or some government official says, yeah, well, that was really a great thing we did, that's what your officials are going to relate to the most. So look for local stuff. You can go, if you're going to go beyond local, you want to go to the big guns, and that's why I've got these 3 resources that you can print out and distribute, or just send the links. You've got the ASPCA, the Humane Society of the United States, and now the National Animal Care and Control Association, all in speaking out favorably about Trap-Neuter-Return. And I also point out, if you're looking for more examples of success, the Managing Community Cats, a guide for municipal leaders from HSUS, has a number of case studies in there that you can cite. Have a plan for when you succeed. You'd be surprised how often people don't have that. And I learned that the hard way when I advocated for a group and convinced the council that they were enthusiastic about trying Trap-Neuter-Return, and then nobody local actually wanted to do the work, and it just fell flat and set everything back by 5 years. So also, if you present a proposal that is, like, this is what we're going to train the caretakers, we have this many traps, we have these veterinarians on board, so that you're good to go as soon as they give you the green light, that's going to help you to persuade them to try it. But don't bother if you don't have a plan for if they agree. Pilot projects, if there's any hesitancy, pilot projects are a nice, safe way for the government to test something out before, put their toe in the water, before diving in all the way. So if you don't think you're going to get the whole, score a touchdown, and go for the field goal and propose a pilot and just say, hey, let's look, if you're hesitant about this at all, let's try it. Let's do 100 cats and see what happens and see how people in the community feel about it. And usually that's a no lose situation, and it's rare that a government won't agree to at least try a pilot, especially if you're paying for it. Just be careful when you get the okay to do a pilot that you structure it so that it's more likely than not you'll have favorable results. So don't pick the most difficult situation in the town, like the 50 black cats behind the railroad station who only come out after 3 a.m. Pick the 50 cats on the block where your friend lives, and they show up every morning at 9 reliably, and half of them you could probably pick up and put in a trap. That's what you want your pilot to be, because you need to show success, and your government officials aren't going to know an easy situation from a hard situation. They're just going to know success versus failure. So make sure if you do a pilot that you set it up that you're going to succeed. Don't plead for the kiddies. Again, it goes back to, this is not what government officials are interested in. Their job is more about public welfare, not animal welfare. So you are a cat population control expert. You're not a cat lover. Like I cringe when people get up at the mic at town council meetings and they go, I'm a cat lover who, and then you can just see the counselors are just immediately tuning out. But if you present yourself as, I'm an animal welfare expert, I have this much experience, I'm interested in population control, that's going to catch their attention. Dress professionally, don't leave the sweater with the paw prints at home. Again, we're trying to, I break the suit out of the closet, well, I don't think I have, well, around here they wear aloha shirts, but anyway, I dress appropriately for my audience because I don't want my appearance to in any way take away from my message. Okay, so at this point, Stacey, we have a little time. We could take some questions.
Excellent. Great presentation, Bryan, as always. And I just love this photo. This is another one that I think you should submit to the Cat Writers Association photography contest.
I can't take credit for this one. This is one of our caretakers who graciously allowed us to use it. So,
well,
but it's a great shot.
Yeah, it is a great shot. So you all capture some incredible pictures. All right, but back to business here with questions. So someone did mention that they work in the village, in the clerk's office at their village, and they say the number one complaint is cats.
Yeah. And if you can get that on paper, or if you can say to the town clerk, do you mind if I quote you on that? That's powerful stuff. That shows you that there's a problem.
Somebody asked a quick question here, that the links mentioned to the public opinion studies, would that be in that HSUS document that you referred later on in the conversation, or
surveys and stuff? I would recommend shoot me an email, Bryan, BRYAN, at neighborhoodcats.org, and I'll send you all the links.
Great.
There's 3 or 4 surveys that have been done over the last 10 years or so.
Okay. And then another person asked this question, but this was also before that HSUS link came out. It says, where is there a place that I can find concise statistics and case studies that detail just not the effectiveness of TNR, but the comparative analysis to other policies?
Oh, that's a good one. I don't know that exists, actually. That is a good one, because you're kind of doing before and after. I know, like here in Maui, the Maui Humane Society had a trap and remove euthanize policy, and then at 2015 or so, they switched to Trap-Neuter-Return, and the intake and the euthanasia rates went from 80% euthanasia to 80% live release. So it was a very rapid switch. So you would want to look for a situation like that. But whether that's been compiled and published somewhere, I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, and the only other thing I can think of is the simulation paper that John Boone did. And so if someone's looking for that, if they ran some simulations about, like, if you did 25% of the cats in the colony, if you did 50%, if you did 75, it's all simulated. It wasn't real practice. But if you want, you can also email me, Stacey at Community Cats Podcast, and I can dig around and try and pull that one out. Okay, so what do you do if your animal control officer is really the problem and just does not believe in TNR, and they're working hard to convince most of the city officials that TNR does not work?
Well, you need to identify what their arguments are. So one of the things that I always say about what's great about being an advocate for TNR is you're an advocate for the truth. You're just telling it like it is. You're not having to construct things and twist things or slant things. It's just really the truth. It really is the only solution that works. So you need to find out what is this animal control officer telling the city officials? Why is she saying it's so bad? And it probably comes back to what we were talking about, is she's spending all her time telling them how horrible free roaming cats are and not offering solutions. So you need to find out what she's saying, get the statistics, show your city councilors, hey, whatever she's doing, it isn't working because we're getting the same number of complaints every year. We got the same number of cats coming in. We're still euthanizing, so she's wrong, and get them to stop listening to her about what the problems the cats are, and again, shift the conversation to solutions, because I guarantee you your animal control officer is not. She's being against something, like saying don't do TNR, is not being for something. So let's stop talking about what she's against and let's start analyzing what this person is for. And that's where you can convince somebody to try something else.
This person says, whenever I've tried to speak with city agencies, they claim that the science works against TNR. Namely, they refer to Peter Mara's article in Nature magazine in 2013. Is there any legitimate article that I can use to explain that study is discredited?
Well, there's a ton of academic research that's out there. But again, I think it's more effective to bring it to local, right? Which is Peter Mara, in all his articles and all his books, he does exactly what I talked about. He spends 99% of the time vilifying the cats, talking about they kill so many birds and they do this and they do that. And he spends very little time talking about what to do with it. So you need to shift the conversation. You don't want to get into a back and forth of what I call a battle of the studies. You want to go to them and say, well, what are you doing now? And let's look at the data, and hey, nothing is improving, and get that light bulb to go off and talk about what you're going to do about it. Don't get into arguments about whether Peter Mara's article is correct or not. So when they say, oh, but Peter Mara's, says it's a horrible thing and TNR doesn't work, well, what are you doing and how effective is that? And then again, you go into local examples, you go into ASPCA and you may cite the United States. That's how you would counter an anti-TNR argument. You don't want to get into a scientific battle though.
The other thing too that I'm just going to let everybody know up front, that it's not just about TNR in that community. You're going to have a really hard time proving that TNR works if you do not have access to affordable spay-neuter services for the owned cat community. It will reduce your population somewhat depending on how intense your management is of those outdoor cats, but it's not gonna be as dramatic of a move as if you are also getting what I call Adam and Eve out of their apartments and getting them spayed or neutered also. I would assume you'd agree with that statement, Bryan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the more holistic the solution is, the better. One point I would disagree with you on, though, is when you go into a community that is really overwhelmed with community cats, that initial transition to Trap-Neuter-Return usually does have very dramatic results. However, if you want to continue to improve, then you have to get to the source of the free roaming cats, which is usually the owned cat population. So I see that as sort of a phase two. In the end, yeah, you got to do both.
It was funny, earlier today we were talking about Lowell, Massachusetts, which you are familiar with that project. Back
Sure.
in the day, you helped with PetSmart Charities, you worked with us funding that project. And so we were in there with significantly focused Trap-Neuter-Return money as well as owned spay-neuter money. And I mean, the kittens just went down dramatically. The number of kittens that they took in within 3 years was probably a third of what they were taking in, 3 years earlier. And so that's usually the first wave that hits you when you go into a community. You might even have a little uptick. People get all weirded out in the first 3 months, like all of a sudden the phone rings because you've got a new program and they think, oh my gosh, we've got this uptick. This isn't working. And it's like, no, you got to let it kind of digest, let the spay neuter get working. And then you're going to see these dramatic drops. And then you'll see the own cats trail after the kittens for sure.
Well, you know what it is, in the end, it's realizing that the problem is cats who are not fixed, right? And trap-neuter-return is just, well, this subset of cats, we have to use traps. We have to capture them. They're not, in this subset of cats, we can pick up and put in a carrier. But in the end, they're all cats and they're all reproducing. So the more of them you can get spayed and neutered. So like in Australia, we work in Australia, and our first piece of advice to them was do not call it TNR. Just call it spay neuter, or they call it desexing over there.
Right.
It's a desexing program, and focus on that. Focus on the word sterilization. Don't focus on trapping and returning and things like that, because basically that's what it comes down to. Is you're just trying to, the more cats you can get spayed and neutered, the fewer kittens you're going to have. It's not rocket science.
Yep, exactly. All right. Well, we are at the end of our time. This was great presentation, Bryan. Thank you very much. And what we're going to do, there are a couple of links mentioned. And what we'll do is we'll make sure that they get hooked up on our recordings page for folks. So when the recordings come out, those links will be out there for our attendees too. And good old Danielle Bays out there in the audience has given us the computer modeling document. So I'll throw that in the chat for folks here too. Oh, one last question before we go, though, Bryan. Cat stats. There were a couple of questions about cat stats earlier today. Do you want to just share with the group a little bit of detail about that?
Yeah, CatStats is an online database where you can have your colony caretakers or managers. They can create their own account and they can enter the statistics, like where are they, how many cats were there when they started, how many are fixed, how many are there now, and you can begin to map out on. It creates Google Maps. So you can visually see the TNR at work in your program and you can keep track of it. So go to CatStats, CATSTATS.org, and you can register there. Just be aware we're a little behind right now because of all the work we're doing in the disaster zone. But go ahead and sign up. It's $50 a year, which for an awful lot of technology. And then again, you can email me if you have questions about it. But we use it in New York City. We've tracked thousands of colonies. We get a cat coming in and there's maybe no microchip, but they can tell us where the cat came from. So we go look at our Google Maps. We see what colonies are in that area, and we can often reunite the cats. We use the statistics you can calculate percentage of cats sterilized in colonies in different areas, and you can see how some areas need more services than others. So there's a lot you can do with that kind of data.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. If folks want to see more of Bryan, we'll be with him next week from 2 to 4:45 Eastern time with our TNR certification workshop. We've had a couple of groups actually interested in exploring that and requiring their volunteers to become TNR certified. So we will be doing a workshop next week at 2 o'clock. And we have Susie Richmond in the background answering your toughest trap-neuter-return questions. And Bryan doing an incredibly detailed presentation for anybody who's never trapped a cat or new to it, or just ensuring everybody's got the right skills, doing the right things, and not opening up the trap door and sticking their hand in and flipping the traps around and all those fun things. So just making sure everybody's got the same trap-neuter-return language going on when they're trapping cats. I was going to say handling cats, and we do not handle cats when they're in traps. So we are just making sure everybody is well trained. So that information's all on the Community Cats Podcast website. Bryan, thank you so much for spending some time with us this weekend.
My pleasure as always.